Rosemary Tourniquet for Sean Bonney. No, not the wish for the downfall of the Western world, but the downfall itself arrives. A rosemary tourniquet wrapped around its forearm. Songbirds nesting in the winter of its sixth extinction's chest. Below, the riot crawls like a toddler out of its wage crib, and songbirds fly in cemetery arcs above the coup and its calligraphers. The downfall of the Western world stutters when it speaks of land reform and lithium, mouthing vowels so distended they turn cows to villanelles, hurl a gibbous moon at the money form. Before the downfall of the Western world, my mother welded her meals from scraps. Now she walks in iambs toward the kitchen sink, and the sun sets like an old bruise in the moment of all plenitude. To fix the price of bread, she says, set blaze to business schools.
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico, an angsty youth group teen writing you poetry based off the Song of Songs.
Oh, yikes. I'm Dean Detloff, and I am your failed Christian poet turned evangelical CCM singer-songwriter.
All right. Lord, I lift your name on high.
This week on the show, we're talking with Dominick Knowles, who, among many other things, is an editor at Protean magazine, which is a really neat lefty mag. They publish poetry, but also essays and other kinds of stuff. A really neat project of independent publishing in general. And Dominick is responsible for a lot of the poetry that gets in there. So we're really excited to talk to Dominick about their own thoughts on poetry. We talk about some academic work that they've done. We look at some poetry from a really wild Marxist in the 30s. This episode's got it all. We get into more about what Protean's going on and what Dominick thinks about the poetic process and their own poems. And there's just a lot happening, I feel, but all extremely good stuff.
Yeah, totally. If you're playing the Magnificast home game, you can go to Viewpoint Magazine and read Dominick's essay, A Spectre in Every Street, George Oppen and the Poetics of Communism. It's a good essay. Man, this is what I need to get into poetry. I need historical essays about it. That's my hook. That's the thing that's going to get me really excited about it.
Yeah, that's right. We need just the driest cartography that one could offer in order to figure out where all these poems fit.
That's what really speaks to my my grad school crushed soul is just historical writing. Oh, love it.
Matt, how's this for just a thought about poetry? What if instead of calling it poetics, we called it poetics, kind of like politics?
Nice. Now that is awfully close to poetry, what you've just done there, I think.
It's pretty close. I think it's closer to being a song because you do have to hear it.
Huh. Okay. Well, I feel like we're really close to going down a terrible rabbit hole that we do not need to go down there right now. So instead of that, let's go right over to our interview with Dominick. This week on the Magnificast, we have Dominick Knowles. They're a grad student. They study poetry. They write poetry. And they write about also communism. And listen, we love it all. We love all of those things on this show. So Dominick, I don't know. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit? Who are you? What do you do? What do you work on? Those kinds of things.
Sure, yeah. I'm a fourth year PhD candidate at Brandeis. I study like Cold War U.S. poetry and imperialism in Latin America and the relationship between poetry and democracy and the imperial impulse. I'm a union steward and I'm a communist. So that's pretty much all there is to my identity.
Great job. You've done it.
Thank you.
Well, cool. I mean, we'll get into how all those moving parts kind of fit together, I guess, throughout the course of the conversation. As you know, I guess, from kind of following the podcast a little bit, the idea behind our conversation and the arc so far has just been to explore how poetry operates as it relates to Christianity and the left together. And it's kind of an interesting way into that conversation that we've never been able to explore. So we're glad to have you on. We figured we might start talking a little bit about how some poets have worked out their politics through their poetry or intention with poetry generally. So we read your article in Viewpoint called "A Spectre in Every Street, George Oppen and the Poetics of Communism." I think that might be just kind of a nice way into the conversation. Could you give us maybe a summary of what you're trying to do in that article and what you're talking about, I guess, for folks who haven't read it?
Yeah, sure. So article's basically talking about Oppen. He was one of the later modernist poets. He first published a book in 1934 called A Discrete Series. And basically what kind of fascinated me about his whole body of work is that at one point in like 1935, he had just finished his first book. It got like a good review by Ezra Pound and everything. And then he was like, poetry is fucking useless. It doesn't do anything. I'm going to go join the Communist Party and, give speeches at strikes and, try to organize, and that moment of just being like, this has no use value anymore. The things that I'm creating are actually a detriment or an impediment to like making the world a better place. I thought that was such a fascinating moment. So I tried to like parse the relationship between that, because he did start writing again in 1958 at the end of his exile in Mexico. So basically my thesis of that is that when you stop writing poetry to go do radical shit in the world, you actually don't stop writing poetry. You're actually realizing the poem in those moments. So there's a continuity between when you put down your pen and stop writing and when you pick it up back, again, when you've done your political work.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. It's also a little bit scandalous too, that you just stop writing, or that that you couldn't do both at the same time. I guess I think that's like a challenging idea. It's definitely an idea that runs kind of contrary to some of the poets we've been reading over the last few weeks, especially Ernesto Cardenal, who he's merging completely his poetic work with his larger political project as the Minister of Culture in Nicaragua. I guess I was reading your essay, and on the one hand, I have Ernesto Cardenal, who's like practicing his politics through poetry and like teaching peasants and whoever, to write. And then on the other hand, there's George Oppen, who is kind of like an interesting foil to that way of thinking. So, not only does Oppen not combine his politics with his poetry, and maybe it's a different kind of formulation, but instead he thinks it would be explicitly bad to do that. So can you explain a little bit more about like what's going on with Oppen and like the wedge between poetry and politics, or maybe the seeming wedge or something, if it's not exactly like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of it's an overdetermined kind of thing. But I think it's important to realize that, in the 30s, there was socialist realism, and George Oppen was really not a fan of the kind of party prescribed, aesthetic stuff. So his idea of political poetry, which is kind of inaccurate actually, but like super stilted, very formalist, serves the explicit purpose, of the party or of, the masses. And basically, there's this quote that I think I quote in the, he's basically just like, I don't believe in, like a man saying, well, I'm a poet and I'll make my contribution to the cause by writing poems about it, because you're actually not making a contribution to the cause in his argument. He said, if you decide to write poetry, then you write poetry, not something that you hope or deceive yourself into believing can save people who are suffering. And so I think that the context of the uselessness of political poetry in his mind really informs why he stops writing, as opposed to someone like Cardinal, who is coming out of a completely different tradition. But I think he just felt really guilty. He also like was pretty well off for, you know, the first part of his life. He gave a lot of it up, but I feel like that guilt of like having been raised like a petty bourgeois subject also haunted him. So he went down harder on it than, you know, someone like Cardinal.
Yeah, that's really interesting. As you were saying that, I guess I found myself wanting to know a little bit more too about the sort of political poetic landscape that someone like Oppen would have been thinking about. So you mentioned he's participating in a certain modernist tradition. He's also reacting against a particular conception of socialist realism. But it just seems to me like maybe it's just because I know to look for it now or something, but it seems like there's a renewed interest in communist poetry, especially from the height of the movement in the 30s and 40s and that sort of thing. Do you have any sense of kind of what's in the air, I guess, for, you know, people who are politically on the left and also doing poetry at the same time, maybe in that kind of like sphere at the height of the labor movement in the US?
Yeah, I mean, so Carrie Nelson is a scholar who wrote this really good book called A Repression and Recovery. And it traces basically that whole movement and the coexistence of like communist poetry or labor poetry and like, you know, labor songs, and the way that like a lot of that kind of more formalist stuff like the Wobblies, like Little Red Songbook, and things like that, are, you know, in a continuum with, you know, a poet like Kenneth Fearing, who is a very you know, kind of famous proletarian poet, sort of the kind of opposite tendency of Oppen. But yeah, I think that you know, Oppen's whole school, the Objectivists, not really a school, but it was a bunch of guys, plus Larry Niedecker. They were kind of ostracized in a bunch of different ways. They were ostracized by the, you know, publications of the Communist Party for not, you know, adhering to, you know, party aesthetics, but also for their name, because the Communist Party interpreted, you know, objectivist as not being the kind of Randian thing that came later, but, you know, as being, you know, objective and not taking a political side. So from the start, like as soon as they started calling themselves that, they were already sort of in the shit. But if you go back and look at what the objectivists were trying to do, among whom are like Zhukovsky, Verkazi, and those people, like most of them were also communists. They just sort of didn't believe in the aesthetic that was dominant at the time. And I mean, if you go back and read stuff by Zhukovsky, and, you know, his like super long work, I mean, there's like block quotes from Capital and the Grundrisse, you know, in there. So they were really deeply engaging with this, but they were taking a more sort of like, you know, historicist rather than like a propagandist mode. And it didn't really work out for them as far as getting, you know, published by the people who had the same beliefs as them.
That's really interesting. Huh. It's maybe a good distinction to set them up as historicists rather than propagandists. That's at least helpful for me thinking about it. But last week, no, man, it's hard to tell time in terms of podcasts. Several weeks ago, we read this really goofy poet named Joe Wallace, who is a Catholic, communist, and Canadian poet. Who
the three genders.
Yeah, that's it. That's all of them. Yeah, he. I mean, he was extremely goofy. He had like lots of like very I don't know. For him, poems aren't poems unless they rhyme. This whole kind of thing, kind of using sort of like that 19th century sort of like you know, like rhyming verse. That's like his whole thing. Anyways, he thought of you know, he thought of like proletarian poetry as being, you know, written for, you know, for workers and as a sort of pedagogical tool or propagandistic tool. What would someone like Oppen think about that, though? Like, he for Oppen, it's like, not going to happen. But what would he think about other folks doing that who are communist? Is there like a critique that he had of them, or just wasn't really interested?
Yeah, so he had a name, a kind of, like very boring name for that kind of stuff. He would just call it communist verse with a capital C, capital V. And he didn't like it. I mean, he wanted to resist the kind of like formally conservative, rhyming verse that even, like Langston Hughes or McKay, or Joseph Freeman or any of the big kind of, proletarians, even if he liked some. I think he wrote a review of one of Hughes's books that was like positive, but it still sort of thinks of it as aesthetically like inferior or deficient in some way. And moreover, that it's actually not doing what it says it's doing. If you think about like a propaganda poem or one of the like If We Must Die by Claude McKay, which is a great poem. And it seems to be like this rallying call to like, resist like, racist capitalist imperialism. And it seems to be based in a materialist politics, but, Oppen would say, no, the aesthetic form of this, the fact that it relies on what he would consider like 19th century kind of outmoded stuff, the fact that the form of it is not, evolving with the politics, means that it is, somehow, deficient in a way.
It's really wild, really fascinating too. I guess I feel maybe like my brain is too much of a novice to sort of internalize this in a sense that's more than like, that's an interesting thing that a communist thought about some other communists. But yeah, maybe I could have you move into more familiar territory for my own selfish benefit by talking about Alain Badiou's thoughts on poetry and communism, because that comes up in your article on Oppen as well. So for Badiou, poetry and communism have an essential link in some sense. So could you talk a little bit about Badiou's thoughts on how these things go together, a contemporary communist thinking about this stuff, and how that sort of opens up the conversation with Oppen for you?
Yeah, sure. I think about that that part of Badiou like twice a week, because it has like driven itself so far into my mind in the most annoying way, where I actually like a lot of what he has written. But the argument to me feels so like even though the word, like just kind of like lazy, in a way. And like, so, his argument runs pretty much as follows: that, the essential link between poetry and communism is forged through, the concern for what is common to all, which is language itself, because we all have language. And what bothers me, besides the fact that, of course, like we all have language to like some degree, and it doesn't really, like, language doesn't have a politics that's inherent to it, is the fact that it's so kind of tempting to just kind of agree with. Because I remember the first time I read it, I was like, hell yeah, this is exactly true. This is the commons, the true commons, is like the fact that we all use words. And I thought about it more, and I was like, this is like weirdly like an abstract formalist thing that has no real relationship to, not only actually existing, communist states or anything, but even like the organizing principles that like we have used to like make the world a better place. So it just seemed too like platonic in a way. Yeah. So that's sort of. I'm also coming off of my reading of Mark Stevens' book called Red Modernism, which makes a similar case against Badiou, and he articulates it really well in that he actually calls it like an abstract formalism And he says that basically, if you want to write about communism in poetry, but you don't talk about political economy, then you're not really making any argument at all. And I agree with that in a lot of ways, but it's definitely a better version to me than Baju's. But yeah, had you read the Poetry and Communism article? Or
No, I haven't.
It's a trip. It's worth reading.
Yeah, that it sounds like something worth reading. I should say the only book about poetry, theory book I've ever read is Julia Kristeva's book, Revolution in Poetic Language, which is a wild book.
Oh yeah,
it's wild. Yeah, I read it in college, and I have no idea what's in it now. I couldn't even tell you what it was about.
That's probably fine. I definitely do not need to tell anybody about it. Yeah. Well, are there certain contemporary theorists though that you do find, I guess, useful to think about these relationships between communism and poetry in particular, or do you feel with what was going on back in the 30s was kind of an important thing to recover that's been lost, or what's maybe the landscape around this discourse?
The Carrie Nelson book is, I think, really important because of how much poetry it actually exhumes from the archives that have been forgotten, and it is sort of the text that I always kind of come back to, even though the actual work that I'm doing now is not in the 30s. But I feel like something that's been really useful to me to think about in terms of the 30s has been how that legacy has been either kind of preserved or mutated in some way. So a lot of what I've been reading has been later, but as far as the 30s, one of the best books that I've read on it is it's called Left of Poetry by Sarah Ellers, and it just does a lot of cool kind of updating of what Nelson is doing. I'm holding it right now. I'm trying to look through it to find something that's useful to say. It's like a historicist kind of text, but yeah, it's it wants to talk about the importance of the historical kind of imaginative work that revolutionary poets have made, and the way that they have experimented with form in different ways. So it's sort of like the same problem, that Oppen, versus say McKay or a proletariat poet, how the importance of form has changed over the course of the 30s. But yeah, so Sarah Eller's book is awesome. Trying to think, I'm looking through a fucking stack of shit that I'm using for my dissertation right now. There's the Communism and Poetry anthology that just came out. I have only been able to read it in snippets because it's $300 or some shit on the internet, and I can't afford it. But I've read kind of bits and pieces of it, and it's edited by Ruth Jennison and somebody else who I forget. But that collects essays. I think something by Joshua Clover's in there, and it's just sort of one of the first anthologies that I've ever seen that really collects a broad kind of swath of interpretations of the relationship between either 1930s proletarian poetry or kind of more contemporary anarchisty kind of influenced poetry. So yeah, that would be something I would totally recommend for you all to check out.
That's cool. It's really helpful to have directions to go on these things. So that's good. Okay, well, before we get back to Oppen, here's another poem from Dominick.
Hadal Zone in the age of deindustrialization. There's a smokestack at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. There are people there, and goodbyes and tendon-long whispers. Industrial glitter scales of disbelief and the abad splitting open like a clam. We blame it on the free market. We blame it on the grammar of surfaces, while on the ruined seafloor a fish rots from the head down, dreaming of the wide disease at the precise moment when capital decides to drown us. My boss denies me a raise, and the cops find him at the bottom of the trench, sucking on smokestacks and screeching out mating calls to an ancient sea devil. He looks like a blind machine sleepwalking off the edge of a motel balcony. If the motel balcony was a tectonic plate and drowned men could sleepwalk. O pond eater, O lemon whirler, O deep sea shift manager, read the moon back to me. Give what's left of its light a name. Terraform the waves with the density of wage theft.
Well, maybe we can round out Oppen a little bit more and then turn to something else. So
Sure.
yeah, I think the way his life goes, at least based on my recollection of your article, is that so he leaves the Communist Party. He decides to go fight Nazis, and then after the war, the FBI is kind of keeping too close an eye on him, and then he goes to Mexico. Is that all right?
Oh yeah. So basically, as soon as he comes back from the war, the feds are like, "Fuck you, dude! Like, we have files on you. We know what you're up to." And this is obviously during the the first kind of stirrings of McCarthyism and all that. And so the HUWAC or the HUA, the whack, however the fuck you say it, went after him, and he and his family went to Mexico, where they lived until the late 50s. And the weird thing is, during this time, he never fucking wrote anything. And if he did, he destroyed it. There's no records from his time there at all. He was there with his wife, Mary, and I believe his daughter. And he was in a community of writers, in Mexico in the 50s. There were tons of, U.S. kind of expats, either who were, being exiled there, or someone like Audre Lorde, who, kind of chose for personal and political reasons to go to Mexico City in 53 or something. And there was also this sort of nation kind of psychedelic tourist industry that poets would just kind of go. I think Charles Olson did this, Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti, and a bunch of other people did this, and they would just take peyote and try to reconstruct post-war America by going into Mayan ruins and doing some kind of kind of cringy but also kind of interesting stuff on indigenous cultures. So there was this huge community there, but Oppen didn't talk to anybody really. There's in his wife's memoir, there's 2 pages on their time in Mexico. So it really is a gigantic kind of chasm of artistic and social silence until 1958 when he wrote Blood from the Stone. So yeah, and then he just kept writing and never stopped again. So something changed in his brain, I guess.
Yeah. Do you know what that was? Did he stop being a communist and he started writing again, or how did he negotiate that?
He basically, this is kind of a deflating thing. There's not really a big theoretical insight. He was basically just I really love writing poetry. I'm getting older, and I am. He preserves his beliefs. He was pretty much a Marxist his whole life, but I think the war really fucked him up. He almost died in a foxhole, and so I feel like he felt like he had things to account for. Finally, that poetry was kind of capable of dealing with. Whereas I feel like for his first book, right when he stopped writing, he really hadn't experienced the world yet in the way that he eventually did. And and I think that, he also did make his poems, into the world, and so by doing that, I felt like he kind of, opened something up, where he could be more comfortable with writing poetry, even through the Vietnam War or things like that. But there was no big, sea change that he described, besides the fact that he just felt like his life, was entangled in things that were, worth poeticizing.
So all that's really fascinating about his life. You conclude the article with a really interesting sentence. Maybe we can sort of leave it here and have you kind of open up this like meditative poetic cone, if you will, and then we'll turn to some of your work at Protean and poetry in general. But you write at the end of this article, the relationship between poetry and communism is a formula that must be, to borrow Marx's language, demystified and set back on its feet. Rather than make the world into a poem, George Oppen's example demands the making of the poem into the world. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? And also, in light of what you were just saying, when he eventually is like, oh, I think of just like writing poetry after all, kind of making the world back into a poem or something. How do these all go together?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. That sentence, I feel like, relates more to the act of stopping your writing, over than the kind of like acceptance that you can keep, on writing, even though there's like, kind of urgent political problems. But in the most kind of, reductive way that I can make it, I mean that last sentence to suggest, like, if you light a cop car on fire, that's a poem. If you get a union contract, that's a poem. And there is this really important continuity that I feel like his lesson is not that we should stop writing and, just do organizing stuff, but that, there is no break between these things. And so if we can kind of merge them in our political consciousness, then like we'll be able to kind of synthesize something that relieves that tension, or that like allows us to like sort of poeticize the world in a way that makes it better. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. It definitely gives me a lot to think about. I'll have to keep on thinking about it. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about your own participation, I guess, in the world of poetry as it is, and at least insofar as you are, and your own work. So we'll talk about your own poetry in a moment, but first, could we talk a little bit about Protean magazine and what it is, and what your role is there, and what sets it apart from other political or literary kinds of magazines?
Cool. Yeah, I'd love to. So Protean is, a leftist kind of magazine that does, essays, and art and poetry, and fiction too. Yeah. So I got on board with them a few months ago. I had just gotten a couple poems published by them, and then we became friends. And then they asked me to, join the team. But it's super. I mean, I think it's really an amazing project, and it actually lets me to kind of have some continuity with what we were just talking about. It lets me kind of dial back and forth between the two impulses that I have. Between we have to write straight up propaganda poetry, and also we can kind of reconcile like aesthetic experimentation with a left political impulse. So that's been probably the most fun. Is one, there's no better feeling on the fucking planet than like publishing other people's work and like seeing them respond, seeing other people respond, and like seeing how these kind of poetry communities form. So that's been like super fun. But yeah, it's just kind of like pleasurable to be able to indulge like all of my weird aesthetic fantasies by like publishing other people's stuff that I think does something that I couldn't do or something like that.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, there's a new issue coming out soon, and I'm looking forward to it. It'll be a really neat thing.
Yeah.
Well, cool.
Eli Valley did the fucking cover, man.
Yeah, I know. It's it's really
that's
neat.
right.
I was like, how the fuck did you land that, dude? That's crazy.
It's a big get for sure.
Yeah.
I'll say that the first issue is cool too, but Eli Valley is next level.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, maybe we can kind of turn towards some of your own work as well. So in past weeks, we've talked with some about some poets, like historically, and some real life poets as well. Yeah, they've all found some interesting ways to like merge together their poetic work and their politics. And I don't know, like, you know, there's George Oppen for sure, and Ernesto Cardenal. But I guess, how do you work that out yourself? Is that a question you're really interested in dealing with, or is that kind of you know, on the periphery?
No, I mean, it's something that I think about. It's something that if I think about it while I'm writing poetry, I will not be able to write at all. But it's something that will crop up when I'm like halfway through a draft, or when I'm, you know, trying to edit something. And sometimes it's as like dumb and simplistic as like, can I make this more communist? Can I add some shit about like me beating the fuck out of my landlord? You know what I mean? And you know, and sometimes it's at that kind of base level, but I feel like, you know, as a kind of like, you know, Marxist communist poet, like so much of, you know, Marx's early writing was about expanding the human sensory like apparatus. So there's this deep kind of affinity to me between like really like, you know, intense kind of sensory poetry and its rhythms, and the kind of, you know, music of you know, language and things like that, with the communist project. That doesn't just have to be you know, this is a poem about me like organizing, you know, a union or something, which is also amazing. But yeah, I try to like think about the kind of history of these, you know, communist poets and their problems when I'm writing. So a lot of stuff that I have written recently sort of either borrows lines from, or, you know, paraphrases or starts with a line from another poet, and then I might end up, you know, changing it or erasing it or something. But I'm trying to like merge that with my own stuff. Just you know, it feels like an anchor in something that is like a legacy I want to participate in or something. But yeah.
You also have some theological themes that sort of shine through in your poems as well. How does that go together with your political sensibilities?
Are you talking about one poem in particular?
Just sort of based on, I guess, what I see you tweeting about, or that sort of thing, and your interest in people like Cardinal and what they're up to. And certainly, like, maybe I'm projecting or something, but I feel one of the poems that you had sent us, the title escapes me right now, but it's about seeing a person on the street and kind of meditating on their state and what that says about society, etc. There's obviously a certain communist impulse there, but I just feel there's this kind of I don't know, like, idea of looking for the least of these, or the wretched of the earth, in both the sort of biblical and political sense. Yeah, I don't know. Again, maybe I'm projecting, but maybe those themes are or aren't there. But if you could talk about that at all.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I was, you know, raised like deeply Catholic. I wanted to be a priest when I was younger. Was an altar boy, the whole deal. So there's a lot of just like, I feel like you can never actually stop being a Catholic. It's just like a framework that is like baked into your brain forever.
Yeah.
So like by reckoning with that, I tried to take what I think is like useful from that tradition. But yeah, that the one where I think it's about the homeless dude like beating up the cops or something. Yeah, I mean it's, I guess it's theological insofar as like, if God was made manifest, you know, in the world, you know, there would be a pile of cops, you know. It's like, you know, sort of a kind of a simple version of like a divine justice in this way that I sort of find myself fantasizing about a lot. Mostly because the actual situation is so hopeless, and godless. But yeah, I mean, the other poem that I have that seems like kind of theological, as Honey Ash, which basically is like, what if God and I had queer sex with each other and he, penetrated me with a poem. And that was the first poem that I wrote where I actually like had this sort of very like bodily experience writing it. Like most of my other stuff doesn't really deal with like my own body, or it doesn't have lines like the curve of my ass. But yeah, that was one where I was like really trying to, parse, my sexuality, the relationship to, a kind of theological impulse. And there's not a lot of like politics, in that one, at least not explicit ones. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I haven't really worked out a lot of the like theological stuff that I've been thinking about, mostly because I put it out of my head for like 10 years. But I'm trying to come back to it and articulate it in a way that like makes sense.
That's cool. I mean, especially that poem, the Honey and Ash poem, just reminded me of reading a number of like really spicy mystical literature from like the 12th and 13th or 14th century. Yeah,
totally. They were so queer. And and yeah, and like just horny and queer, and like that is not like a mode that I'm like used to being in with my poetry, but I really want to like get into that more because it was really fun to write, and also like, I think the mystics and all that are really cool.
Yeah, that is very fun. I guess like a little bit of a turn more toward the technical side of writing poetry. So it's a new year, 2020. Dean and I are really getting into poetry this year, and
hell yeah.
I think like I have no background in poetry. I'm so dumb about it, but like I'm even just coming to it and reading, poetic works that are so wild, because it's like, how do people even get to this place where they can connect these sentences together, or like even parse them out with these like wild spacings and punctuation? Just like the weird like technician in me is just like, how does this work out in someone's brain? It's so cool. So I don't know, like, what do you think about poetry as a medium? Like, why is that an interesting way to convey meaning or a story or something for you? Like, what's different about it than writing like a paper about poetry or like a novel or something? So I guess something about the medium itself.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, the first answer, which is kind of obvious, is that just like line breaks are, I think, really, really cool little like visual like ticks in a poem, and the patterns that you can make by just like breaking lines, and then all of a sudden your eye is drawn to the last line, and then the first line, in the next line. And in a very kind of like rudimentary way, that's just an interesting way to work with language, where it kind of like approaches visual art in some way. And I have no talent with visual art endeavors. This is as close as I get to that. But like another kind of simple thing about poetry is that usually it's short. And so I really value the process of rereading. And so it's hard to do that with like In Search of Lost Time. It's pretty easy to do that with, like a book of, poems, where you can just engage with it over and over again, and, read it out loud or whatever. And it seems like a fundamentally like an ontologically different like experience, with the visual aspect and the uh, the kind of like musical aspect of it and things like that, I think are really cool.
Yeah, that's neat. I mean, I guess the one way to figure out like why is poetry an interesting medium is to sort of keep on working with it, seeing what it allows you to do. Could you tell us a little bit about your own creative process? Like, how does we asked this question to Tegan Steelfisher last episode too, and I was really interested. How do you come up with a poem? How do you go from I have this thought, or I see this thing in the world, and a line comes to you, and then you kind of decide that whatever, like that's going to be the seed of this thing that you'll kind of water and take care of for a bit. How does that work? Like, what's the creative process for you writing a poem?
Sure. Yeah. So a lot of it, at the kind of earlier stuff came from reading philosophy, actually, and just like finding cool sentences in like Wittgenstein or something like that, and trying to like rearrange it in ways that that sounded like more interesting or more beautiful to me in some way. But like I think that there's a huge connection between like poetry and philosophy, poetry and theory. I think they do things that can kind of get around the kind of logic-centrism of like standard argumentation or like politics and things like that. So like I try to draw from that stuff as much as possible. But at the same time, I also usually end up writing like a line or two into my phone on the notes app while I'm like taking a shit in the morning or something like that. So there's this like highfalutin, like I want to like rewrite, Hegel or something. And then there's like, I am, suffering in the morning and taking a dump. And I just had this like burst of, of an idea that's like 3 words long, but I'm going to make something out of it. And often enough, I just gather like these kind of fragments, over the course of like a month or so, if I don't really have time to sit down and write, and just sort of put them in a Word doc or email them to myself and then just rearrange them, and try to see if it becomes, something that feels coherent.
That makes a lot of sense. That's cool. That's I appreciate the high-minded answer and then the real answer. That's great.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's really fun to hear a little bit about the process. Could you talk maybe also about the editing side? So, all right, someone has gone from typing notes in their phone while taking a dump to presenting you with a real life poem that they're ready to sort of hand off. How does one even edit a poem, right? Like, I write as a journalist, so I get all kinds of edits that way, and I write as a philosopher, and those are edits. But I guess it's hard for me to imagine the kind of artistic edits that you might have to consider as an editor of poetry.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's a lot of it is just going off of like, feeling or intuition, which is not really that interesting to talk about because there's no real way to talk about it. I mean, I've been trying to like give up this idea of like, editing something to death recently because sometimes you like fuck it up when you're editing and you make it worse. And that's kind of annoying. No, I mean, I think that editing is important. But like as far as the like process goes, if I am reading something over and over again that I'd written and something doesn't feel right, like you can read it out loud. Sometimes I do these sort of like randomization like experiments where I'll just like randomly cut and paste different lines in different order and see if that changes the music of it. Sometimes I'll like try to like diagram it in a weird way. Like if the problem is that there's like too many images like stacked and it feels rushed, or it feels like the metaphor can't actually like blossom in a way. Trying to pare down. I think that's another thing that's really important is just like I used to write these like kind of sprawling longer poems that felt more like a kind of like romantic capital R, like first thought, best thought type of thing. And so much of what I've learned through my conversations with other poets actually is just like trying to break the poem down into the smallest possible unit, whether that's an image or like a certain rhythmic figure, and then trying to base it around that one thing so it feels like it's, you know, coherent, sort of like the middle of a clock that the hands will wind around. So I try to always have something that anchors that, and that's kind of what I base the edits around. If I had to come up with something to say about that, yeah.
No, it's cool. I dig it. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Well, if someone wanted to find some of your work, where would they look?
So my stuff is in Protean. I have a poem forthcoming from Glass Poetry. There's stuff in paintbucket.page. There's stuff in Marl's Carks. Oh, you know what? I actually kind of want to say something about those presses for a sec.
Yeah.
If that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So possibly the best thing that has happened to me in the past like 10 years of my life has been meeting the people around the kind of anti-press scene of like Radical Paper Press, Marl's Carks, Best Buds Collective, and Paint Bucket. And like the shit that they're doing is like literally incredible. And I wish that people like George Oppen were around to see the kind of stuff that they're writing and the projects that they're doing, and the way that they're like absolutely bucking the like publishing industry, and the whole cult of awards and prizes and contests and fancy journals that have blood money with them and, you know, are in bed with the people who jack up insulin prices, and all that really kind of nasty shit that like liberals love to kind of gloss over when they're talking about poetry as some kind of, you know, abstract thing that's always on the side of justice. Like, no, like most poems are not on the side of justice. Most poems are on the side of like for-profit, like healthcare companies. So to if you want to look at what is really going on that I think is important in poetry, I would look at those anti-presses, because to kind of return to the beginning of our conversation, they're navigating the apparent contradiction between political commitment and aesthetic experimentation in a way that I have not really seen in, you know, like American poetry, at least. And I just think that shit is so important. And I'm, you know, kind of humbled to be a part of it in some small way. But like, I think they're doing the most important work in poetry right now.
That's great. As you were speaking, I don't know why this never occurred to me as a real life Marxist or whatever, but bringing a kind of materialist analysis to the poetry industry is something that I hadn't really thought to do. And I felt like I could maybe fill in a few gaps of what you were kind of getting at, but can you make some of those things that are implicit a little more explicit for me and for us? Like, you know, when you say some of these journals are tied to the healthcare industry or something, what do you mean? What are you kind of referring to with that?
Yeah, well, Poetry Foundation, the biggest purveyor of poetry in the country, maybe the world, has received like millions and millions of dollars from the Eli Lilly company, which was implicated in like price fixing or something horrible. And the Ruth Lilly like fellowship that they give out is like use that money or something like that. But either way, it's like pretty dirty. And a lot of the poets who have received these awards or who work with the Poetry Foundation refuse to speak out or criticize them at all. And they've engaged in some pretty nasty Twitter stuff, calling the people who are criticizing Poetry Foundation like jealous of their success, and all just really like petty, dumb, childish stuff. When really what what they and we were trying to do is to critique the institutions of power that operate even within a supposedly like neutral or politically left like artistic field. There was another journal that was funded by Koch brothers money, and was like their daughter was the editor, and she like won a bunch of awards in a shady way. There's just a bunch of really like fucked up shit. Also, the Rattle Poetry Foundation is run by like a landlord. So there's just a lot of stuff that's like politically noxious to me about that. And I don't begrudge people who want to publish their stuff there. I mean, it's huge, but I do begrudge people who publish their stuff there and then call the critics of those awards, jealous or, infantile or something like that. Because it's in the same way that you would critique the university. I work for one, but I'm highly critical of where, the money comes from and who is like investing in fossil fuels and things like that. And I wouldn't expect one of my, fellow graduate students to say that I'm being jealous or that I'm being petty by, critiquing the thing that is, keeping me alive right now. But no institution should be, safe from critique. This is it's like basic stuff that I thought we all agreed upon, and to see, left-leaning big name poetry people getting up in arms to defend, the millionaires that pay their bills is like just kind of shitty to me.
Yeah, well, that's good and very good for us to know about, I think, especially as novices to the whole sort of scene and world of it. And also a good reason why people should go check out all the stuff that you're helping to get published at Protean and to support that project. So thanks for plugging that as well.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. Hey, before you just turn this off, because, I mean, who listens to the end, really? Not very many people. I just want to give you a quick heads up. There's going to be one more cool poem from Dominick, so you're not going to want to turn this off. You're going to want to listen through to the very end to hear Dominick's final poem. It's going to be great. Just thought I should give you a warning before you just threw your headphones across the room because you're so mad at your boss or whatever. But before that, thanks for listening. We appreciate it. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. We also got some cool stickers up on our Redbubble store, so check that out too. If you can't support us financially, that's totally fine. We get it. Capitalism sucks. It's kind of the whole thing we're doing here. But you can give us a review on iTunes or, retweet us or something. That's really helpful as well. Cool. Well, instead of the Illogical Spoon and Amari Armstrong, this time here's Dominick Knowles reading an original poem.
3 love poems. 1. On the eve of disgust, we took the bosses by the hair and dragged them straight into an induction furnace. We got high off the fumes of former grievance and passed out naked, listening to Sun Ra and his orchestra. Their heat kept us warm. 2. The police are still murdering black comrades in their cars, conjuring their suicides, the kind of evil that poems can't stop. We shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking this isn't so. We should hate the police before, after, below, beyond the poem. 3. What should interest us now, I think, is the process of liberation, not the imagined future in which liberation loses the referent which is the condition for our imagining it. So before you get evicted from the orgy of totality, take a shit on your professor's car and call it the fruit of impatience with theory.